Wrestlers can become pretty good strikers, and sometimes ditch wrestling almost entirely. With Justin Gaethje's highly anticipated rematch against Dustin Poirier at UFC 291, and with every Justin Gaethje fight in general, I'm always interested to see if Justin will use his wrestling, but time and time and again, he chooses to bang. I mean, I'm not complaining because every time he chooses to bang or brawl, we get a show, but considering his base was wrestling and he was a talented D1 wrestler, this being one of his only 2 takedown attempts in his career is pretty insane. And with Bo Nickal's 5th UFC win a couple weeks ago, he stays undefeated in the promotion. And despite being one of the best collegiate wrestlers of all time, he got this win via KO within the first 40 seconds of this fight. I was reminded of the phenomenon of wrestlers, mainly American and Olympic wrestlers, turning into good strikers with amazing KO power and often leaning towards this striking and sometimes abandoning their wrestling entirely. Justin Gaethje, like mentioned previously, is a perfect example of this. Justin Gaethje has a strong wrestling background at the D1 NCAA level. However, he has chosen to try to knock everyone out in his UFC career since the beginning. I mean, just look at the first 7 fights in the promotion. All the fights he took, win or lose, ended in a TKO or KO. And even though his last 4 fights didn't end in a TKO or KO, Justin's game plan in all those fights were to outstrike his opponent or take his opponent's head off. And again, despite being such a high-level wrestler in college, Justin has only 2 takedown attempts, one against Eddie Alvarez and one in the last 4 seconds against Rafael Fiziev. And on the championship level, we have guys like Jon Jones, who hasn't necessarily completely abandoned his wrestling. However, coming from a strong collegiate wrestling base, he has become a world-class striker in his own regard. Another example of a champion with a strong wrestling base that went on to become a pretty good striker, maybe not as dynamic as Jon Jones, is Kamaru Usman, who, like many of the wrestlers I'm going to reference in this video, have a strong collegiate wrestling base, however has crazy knockout power with knockout performances over Gilbert Burns, Colby Covington in their first fight, and of course his knockout of Jorge Masvidal. And there's definitely more examples we can get into: Michael Chandler, Yoel Romero, Tony Ferguson, etc., but you get the point. American and Olympic wrestlers often turn into really good strikers in the UFC and sometimes even abandon wrestling altogether. But the question is, why? Firstly, let's get into the reason why these wrestlers can become good strikers. The first reason that came to mind was that the training wrestlers do, especially the training for power, is easily transferable to striking. Notice that a majority of the wrestlers I referenced that turn strikers are power punchers. Majority of those guys can knock out their opponent with one punch, and this is due to their hips. A lot of the training and conditioning wrestlers do target the legs and focus on being explosive off the lower part of their body. This explosiveness off their legs help them to shoot for effective takedowns, and especially in Greco-Roman wrestling, having strong and explosive hips that are able to turn quickly help a wrestler throw their opponent from a standing position. And this same power in their lower part of the body can transfer to striking, especially boxing. Like wrestling throws, the power of a punch comes from the hips and lower body. The arms are merely a vessel the power and kinetic energy travels through. So once a wrestler learns the mechanics of a punch or a kick, that explosiveness from shooting takedowns and the powerful rotational force in their hips from performing throws can easily transfer into a heavy strike. And I also think in general, learning the mechanics of striking and becoming an effective striker is just simply easier. Now hold on, I don't want people interpreting this as striking is easy to master and it's just easy for someone who's big, strong, and powerful to be a good striker. That is not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is to be an effective striker is relatively easy. So let me explain. To be a master striker like Israel Adesanya is extremely hard, of course, but to be able to simply strike and hurt an opponent is relatively easy. To be an effective striker, all you really need are your 6 basic punches: your jab, your straight, your hooks, and your uppercuts, and occasionally a good low kick, and that's about it. To learn the mechanics of these strikes, it takes only a couple of months or even just weeks to be effective. Kamaru Usman, Justin Gaethje, Michael Chandler, the list goes on for wrestlers who have basic fundamental strikes with tremendous power. And additionally, I think striking is just simply intuitive. The goal of striking is to hit the opponent with a punch, kick, elbow, or knee, and that simple goal is pretty easy to pick up. So this begs another question: why is it not easy and intuitive to do the other way around? As not a lot of strikers become good wrestlers. Even though I said a lot of the skills and conditioning of wrestling transfer really well into striking, especially the power developed, the same can't be said about the other way around. As a longtime boxer and striker in general, whenever I take grappling classes, I just find it so difficult to adjust. And I feel like all time, there are very few UFC fighters that originate from striking but become good wrestlers. The only good examples I could think of was George St. Pierre, who came from karate but became a dominant wrestler with a beautiful double leg takedown. And maybe today, Alexander Volkanovski, granted he originally came from rugby, which probably helped his grappling. And I think for all the same reasons wrestlers can transition into good strikers, those are the same reasons why strikers don't usually become good wrestlers. The power generated for striking just can't be used for wrestling. Maybe it can help with using your hips and maybe takedowns, but once the fight is on the ground, all striking training is practically out the window. That's another thing. Even if the power from striking helps get the fight to the ground, for wrestling to be effective, the person who took the fight to the ground needs to be able to control the fight on the ground, and nothing in striking really helps with that. That's why it's so much harder for a novice wrestler to be effective in comparison to a novice striker to be effective, because there's always a puncher's chance in striking, but not necessarily a puncher's chance in wrestling. Now going back to the wrestlers, there is another question. Why wrestlers, especially American and Olympic wrestlers, primarily become strikers? I think it's early to say if Bo Nickel will continue to use his wrestling or KO ability, but with his early KO win of Val Woodburn, it brings me into the answer. Striking, especially with the power these wrestlers generate, ends fights early. With the exception of Jon Jones, all the wrestlers I have referenced rely heavily on their power and will end their fights early with that power with one punch or strike instead of outstriking or outlanding their opponents. I mean, if you have that amount of power, would you rather be ragdolling your opponent and grinding them out for 5 rounds, which is much more tiring, or would you rather end the night early with one big bomb? Additionally, these finishes end up being highlights, which lead to fight night bonuses and becoming fan favorites, which is a financial advantage, especially compared to winning the fight by wrestling all 5 rounds. And finally, we get into the last question, which is why Dagestani wrestlers don't often turn into strikers. Dagestani and Chechen wrestlers are known for their high-pressure wrestling and aggression towards taking people down. And this is not without saying that they can't become good strikers, but they often prefer utilizing their wrestling. And the answer is Sambo. Most of the Dagestani and Chechen wrestlers come from a background of Sambo, which unlike American and Olympic wrestling, can have an aspect of striking in the form of combat Sambo. This form has solid striking, which means wrestlers can effectively mix up striking enough to primarily utilize their wrestling and even use it to ground and pound, as opposed to wrestling in the traditional sense, which has no striking. Now this is where it may not make sense, as the form of wrestling with striking leads to primarily wrestling in the UFC, and the form without striking leads to primarily striking in the UFC. But let me try to make it make sense. The striking in Sambo is meant to complement the wrestling and set up takedowns and strengthen the ground and pound overall, which helps the effectiveness of their wrestling. Meanwhile, striking when taught to traditional wrestlers is often taught completely separate from their wrestling, so instead of mixing it up like Sambo, these wrestlers master the fundamentals of a completely different fighting style and now have the choice between the two. And because of the ability of ending fights early and getting more money because of that, they often pick striking. So what do you guys think? Do you believe in this phenomenon of wrestlers becoming strikers because of the reasons I listed in the video? Or is it just pure coincidence that these high-level wrestlers from college or the Olympics just happen to become really good power strikers? Anyways, thank you guys for the support, and I hope to see you guys soon. Peace.